Take two. Thank you. So this time, if you could be a little more enthusiastic about me being here. Really. Thank you for coming out on such a beautiful day, and you won't be disappointed. It's a wonderful film. How many of you had a chance to see it last night? Woo! Good. We'll have a lively discussion, I'm sure. If you haven't, you will catch on quickly. And you'll figure out some good questions, I'm sure. So I'm going to keep it brief. We're just thrilled for our 20th anniversary to be able to kick off the festival with such a wonderful film and to have a returning filmmaker bring it to us as well. So I'm going to bring up the panelists quickly, then bring up our moderator and leave it to them to take it from there. So we've got, I'm going to say director Madeleine Olnek is with us. I always start with the director. And then we have Susan Ziegler, actress Susan Ziegler, and also actress Jackie Monahan. Have a seat, and I'll figure out the mics. I'll be your tech as soon as we get you in place, and we'll get you all set up. And then we have returning to the festival, an old festival friend, Janice Page from the Boston Globe, master moderator who will lead us through today's conversation. Thank you, Janice, and thank you, panelists.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for coming. If you were at last night's opening night screening, you know that Madeleine said you didn't have to come because she went into a bit of the history. Don't worry, there are way more questions. I stayed up all night by candlelight, looking over a cemetery, creating 1,775 questions for her to answer. So they're all right here. No. So to begin, though, she has created a dynamic PowerPoint, I think, and really wants to show it to you. And I think you'll really find it illuminating, and it'll add to what we can discuss afterwards. So I'm going to hand it off to her first.
Okay, so Sasha, I'm sorry, what we decided to do was just show a couple of the images from that PDF, and then we're going to show the clip. Can you bring up, okay. So I just wanted to very briefly, because I know not everyone saw the movie last night, I'm just going to introduce you to the cast of characters before we show this little clip. So that's on the left, the poet Emily Dickinson. That's her famous daguerreotype that was taken when she was 16 years old and played in our movie by Molly Shannon. On the right is Susan Gilbert Dickinson, who was Emily's sister-in-law and who she had a lifelong romantic relationship with, and played right here by Susan Ziegler. Okay. Next page, thank you, Sasha. Here we are. Okay, so that's Austin Dickinson on the left. That's Emily's brother, who was married to Susan Dickinson. And on the right is Lavinia Dickinson, who was played by Jackie Monahan. And then the next slide is a quote. Oh wow, that's just the hanging thing. I was like, what's that design doing? Like the hanging thing. And I have this really great image. Emily wrote that on the back of an envelope, but I, due to the internet in my room, was unable to import it. So I'm sorry, it's really beautiful. There are those who are shallow intentionally and only profound by accident, which leads us to our next slide, Mabel Todd. So Mabel Todd was the mistress of Emily Dickinson's brother, and the person who eventually put together Emily's poems into books and became the spokesperson for who Emily Dickinson was in her lifetime. So I wanted to just set you up with these images. I know probably, how many people saw the movie last night? Really everyone. Okay, so except a couple of people, and this is all for you. But what we're going to do is we're going to just show, I'm going to just show a brief clip which includes a scene that we had to cut from the movie. So anyway, so let's just show it. I know some people saw some of this last night. Okay. Sasha, I'm sorry, can you play that MP4? I feel like I'm still at home on my computer. There's no way to get that. So this is Mabel Todd on her way over to, she would visit Austin Dickinson. They would have, and this is documented, they would have sex at the house where Emily and Lavinia lived. So she would go over there. And so here she is on her way over there on another day. And that was shot in the Bronx. And the reverse was shot in Pasadena in this historical house lot.
Here, let's go tell Austin how you met Emily Dickinson.
Hello, Poppet.
Tell him.
Did you come in the front door?
Mm-hmm. Tell Austin how Emily Dickinson gave you gingerbread.
Ah, what a lucky day for you, little one.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Emily's gingerbread is famous.
Is it so much to ask that I meet your sister Emily in person, face to face? Everyone in town has met Emily, not me. Have you told her how wonderful I am? Have you told her that we would have a great time together?
Emily is just very selective about people she receives. I know that she would like you, dear. She would love you.
I want gingerbread too, from Emily.
Take it off the child. She's likely to get more. Mabel, I always enjoy our little visits. And I hope to enjoy another visit around 8:30.
Come
Would
on,
you
let's
like
go.
a bench
Let's go.
named for you?
Let's go find Emily.
By the train station? I could do that next week. Lavinia, thank you so much for meeting me here.
My pleasure.
And thank you so much for hosting me and my dear friend Mabel Todd at the homestead so often.
You do seem fond of Mabel Todd.
She is Marvel's company. I have a question to you. Are you satisfied with my management of your financial affairs?
Yes.
I'm very pleased to hear that. The law places a stringent burden on me in that regard, and I do like to feel that I'm doing justice by you. I wonder if you could do me a favor and make it so that our Mabel Todd could simply meet our dear sister Emily face to face. Simply see her.
To see her, what about if I do a sketch of Emily and present that to Mabel Todd? She can even keep the sketch for herself.
Or one of your lovely silhouette cuttings.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, or perhaps
That should suffice.
a watercolor. You could learn that and then do a painting ever later.
That would be my pleasure.
That would be marvelous, and it's a very helpful suggestion. But I wonder if you wouldn't just persuade our Emily to just remain in the drawing room while Mabel is playing the piano for a minute and simply say, "So pleased to meet you."
What if Mabel dresses like Emily and looks at herself in the mirror?
To some degree, that's already been done, and it's not been
Oh.
satisfactory.
Oh. Does Mabel know that Emily is a person? Because I do also have a cat named Emily Dickinson. So we wouldn't be lying. She would be meeting Emily Dickinson.
Okay, good. Oh, you can, all right. So skip this, and if we can just resume this very quickly. This is, again, all background. You can skip the next one, which was a repeat of that quote, and go to the next one here. So that's Maddie Dickinson, who's Susan's daughter, and that's Viv, who died at age 8, very tragically. And they had one other child, Ned. The next slide is, okay, so obviously we did ours a little more comically, but the Dickinsons did have an Irish maid. They actually had 2 different Irish maids. One who was named Maggie, and then she left and replaced later by someone named Maggie. And Maggie actually gave Emily Dickinson the trunk where Emily put her poems. Okay, so the next one is, this is just a picture. Now these houses were next to each other. The houses you see in the film aren't the real houses. We did have the opportunity to shoot the museum. Jane Walsh, who runs the museum, which is Emily Dickinson's house, did invite us to come shoot there, but at that time, budget-wise, we couldn't afford that. And I also felt like the landscaping was different from the time that Emily lived there, so even though we would be on the actual place, it wouldn't even be the same place that it was. And we would have just been on the lawn, and I was worried about trucks going by and everything. But anyway, so Susan's home, so Susan Dickinson, her brothers gave some money to Austin and helped with the building of the home. The home had the ceiling and kitchen was designed by Edward Olmsted, who designed Central Park. Her home was very much the social center of the town and one of the most renowned literary salons in New England. And basically every editor in New England knew about Emily Dickinson's work. Passing through Susan's salon, she could read the poems and give them the poems. But they did live right next to each other, which when you think about that time and how it would even be possible to have a close relationship with someone when women had so little agency, proximity made it possible. Okay, then next. Okay, so this is, on the left is Thomas Wentworth Higginson. He was a colonel in the war. He actually led the first all-black troops, the South Carolina Volunteers, the very first, if you've seen the movie Glory, that's not his story. That was the first official commission, but Higginson actually led the first all-black troops, and he was, to my mind, unqualified with his background in poetry, poetry editing. He was, but it was really interesting to me because he was considered just on the vanguard, like he was considered like the fiery abolitionist and a supporter of women's rights. And here, Emily went to him thinking, he's going to be my champion because this is so important to him. But instead, he chose and went with Helen Hunt Jackson he encountered their work at the same time and decided to use his renown to make her the most successful female poet in America. And to add insult to injury, Helen Hunt Jackson was from Amherst. Said Emily had played with her when she was a kid. So not only did she get nowhere with Higginson, but Higginson basically, he was a star maker and made her the star. And if you did see the movie, I did put a snatch of one of her poems in just to experience it fully. And it's really, when you look up her poems, they are laugh out loud, and their simplicity and very traditional concepts of femininity that they convey. Very simple rhyme schemes. But most importantly, I think, because she was a woman poet, and that's already to be on the vanguard in such an extreme way, to be a woman writer, that her work itself had to be very conventional for Higginson to promote it. Okay, the next the next one is, of course, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who did come to Amherst and actually a couple times, but spent the weekend at Susan Dickinson's home and famously mumbled his way through the whole weekend. Everyone very much wanted to hear what he had to say, but no one could hear it. So if that was very, to me, I just thought that was funny. But also a sense of how important that she was in her home was, that he would come visit. And there was very much, the thing to remember about that time was Transcendentalism was the first literary movement in America, and it was centered in New England. Okay, so now I'm just very briefly going to talk about the story of this movie. In a way, is a story of a series of publications. So the first book of poems was published in 1890. Susan had been trying to put a book of poems together. This was after Emily's death. And again, Emily, we see in the movie, we see her trying to get her work, sending her work out, being rejected, sending her work out several times to publisher, sending 90 poems to Higginson. Martha Nell Smith, who's the historian who I worked with on the movie, and she documents 90 times that Emily sent her poems out, around 90, I put they written down, to other people. So people to read her poems, different people who could publish her poems. So these are all submissions made by Emily Dickinson during her lifetime. But this is the first book of poems. It's after, so Susan was taking too long. Lavinia went to Susan, took the poems back, gave them to Mabel. Mabel put together this book of poems. They shopped it around, could not get it published anywhere. Mabel mentions in the movie it was rejected many times. Notably, Houghton Mifflin rejected it, and what their explanation was, the rhyme scheme is too queer. I just couldn't put that in the movie because someone would think, oh, I was trying to be funny, or oh, I made that up, or whatever. But Emily Dickinson was ahead of her time in terms of how she wrote poetry, and because she was ahead of her time and a woman, that was a double whammy. Okay, so Lavinia, after they shopped the book around, it got rejected everywhere. Like I said, Mabel put it together. And Higginson, Mabel did all the work, but Higginson put his name on it. So it was edited by Mabel, Lewis Todd, and Thomas Wentworth Higginson. And even with Higginson's name on it, they couldn't, but so finally Lavinia was like, I'm gonna pay for this book to be published. And she actually had to pay up front because the publisher didn't think a single copy would sell. So she had to pay for the entire printing. As you can see, there's a painting on the front. The painting was by Mabel. She mentions it in the movie. Okay, so that's 1890. That's the first book of poems. That book of poems came out, and people, and one other thing Mabel did that I wanted to put in the movie, but I couldn't because of the timeline, which was when the book was going to be coming out, Mabel met a critic in a summer boarding house, and she thought, this one will do nicely for our good review. Now, I don't know what happened. I always think maybe a hand job. I know there's no documentation for it, so I really can't claim that. I'm glad I'm being videotaped. She set her cap at him. She was a very accomplished flirt. Her dance card was always full. She was able to get Higginson to lend his name to the book, which was more than Emily, Susan, or Lavinia could ever. They couldn't get Higginson to do anything for Emily. So this great review comes out, I think, thanks to Mabel. so people know to go and read the book, and they do. It causes a sensation that they go through all the they go through the printing, they issue another printing. Mabel goes back to work on the second book. We can just go to the next picture. So this was the UK edition, but you can see on the cover it says edited by 2 of her friends. So she was already invested in I'm Emily's friend, and Emily and I were so close. So that was a very important part of her identity, and she did work very hard on these, getting these books together. And doing so, you know, she did stuff to conventionalize them too, that were some things that were unnecessary and some things that were kind of shocking, such aside from slapping titles that were often very reductive to the poem. I don't know if you saw the movie yesterday, you saw a poem called Pain Has an Element of Blank, which was, it's a very moving poem. I think it's so modern.
Yeah.
It talks about just like that state of mind. And Mabel titled that poem, The Mystery of Pain. And then changed the line to her periods of pain. Like, you know, it just made it like you're watching this experience. So she did a lot of stuff like that where they were unnecessary changes that didn't have to happen. So we had the first book, the second book in 1890, she shared the Emily Carter Dickinson, the third book in 1890, oh, excuse me. So the first 2 books of poetry, in between that came the letters of Emily Dickinson. Now this is very important because this is where, putting this together, Mabel was handling Emily's letters to Austin. Austin was her lover, so she was getting this together, she had access to his papers and was going through these letters. Now, Mabel was very savvy, and I think when she read these letters, she immediately grasped the weight of what they were conveying in terms of Emily and Susan's relationship, and also could see, you know, the erotic expressions. And it was, there were these letters that Emily wrote about Susan, and there were lots of letters around the time of Emily finding out Austin was engaged to Susan, which was a little upsetting. So that book of letters came out, and that book had a letter, had a poem, her breast is fit for pearls, that was assigned as a letter to Samuel Bowles, although it wasn't, excuse me, not Samuel Bowles. I have it written down, and his wife. And it had another letter and a brief clip of a letter that Mabel included in the book that said it was addressed to blank, blank, in a little brief paragraph. Now this letter was what went on later to be called one of the master letters, which, just to give a shorthand about it, they were these 3 drafts of letters that Emily wrote some years into Susan's marriage with Austin that I think were actually about Kate. But to blank blank, that name was erased, so that's included in that. Ooh, who's this? And then there was a third. There were these letters where any reference to Susan was erased. Erotic references or expressions of shame, genders being changed from she to he. So those were all the mutilations that are in those letters, which if you see my movie, you'll see that in the end credits. Okay, so then after the first 2 books of poems and the letters of Emily Dickinson, the Dickinsons and Mabel Todd, the Dickinsons sue Mabel Todd, and Mabel Todd countersues, which is a whole another long story I can go into. But so things got, you know, unfriendly, as they do when you sue people, and so the third series of poems, when it came out, Mabel, first of all, she wanted the credit on this on her own. So Higginson's name wasn't on it. It was it didn't have that protection. It was poorly reviewed, and she also didn't hit the festival circuit. I mean, excuse me, the lecture circuit promoting it, which hurt. Okay, so then, whoops. Okay, so I'm just going to talk going through this very quickly about what are the common myths about Emily Dickinson. Now, when she lived in Amherst, because it was so unusual the way that she lived her life for a woman at that time, being socially selective, it was an outrage to many people, and they called her the myth, like, oh, she writes, and she, so they called her the myth, but that evolved into a series of myths or untruths about Emily Dickinson, which unfortunately persist to this day and have a great impact. And I'll explain that to you, why it's important that we've all been told this false story about Emily Dickinson. But I would say safely, myth number one is that Emily was a recluse. Go to the next slide. Okay, so that's a Emily Dickinson poem, and you can go to the next one. Okay, so so she was not a recluse. She was not someone who was frightened and withdrew and hid in her room. She saw who she wanted to, which was, again, scandalous for that time. She was a writer, so she actually needed time to write. And she wrote a lot. Now, for a woman, again, that was like, oh, she's in her room, she's right, whereas that privilege afforded to men is not questioned. It's like, yes, he's doing the work that's so important. So because she was social when she was younger, when she withdrew and decided to focus on doing what she wanted to do, there was resentment in the town for people who knew her when she was younger. Who she was no longer seeing. Back then, people would come calling. Someone would just come to your house, they come calling, ding dong, and your day was over. Like, Emily just refused to give up her time in that way. Her niece has this description of her like going to the landing and like seeing who's down there and being like, I don't want to meet with that person. And that's so different from like, oh, I can't go out there. That's a big difference. So she refused to go to church. Her father allowed her at an early age to stop going to church, which was, again, so controversial for that time, especially in that area, with the Puritan background and the religious background in that area. It was really what that she was able to carve that out for herself. One thing that I should be revealing these things. These are really my notes that only I should be looking at. Maybe we should. But one thing that, I was working on this movie, like, she's not a recluse, she's not a recluse, she's not a recluse. And even I was, when I came across, like, oh, she met with her dressmaker weeks before her death. Like, she only wore one dress, mostly. Like, it's still shocking because this whole thing is so indoctrinated. Okay, it's right. There's a difference between seeing who you want to and being afraid to meet people. Okay, so here's the big turning point, which you saw in the film, if you saw it, and if not, basically, Mabel went over to Emily and Lavinia's house, for several years, and had sex with Austin. Now, when Mabel was out on the lecture circuit promoting those books, it threatened her authority to not be able to say that she had never seen her face to face. And because that threatened her authority so much, she, I think, embellished the stories of what Emily was like to deal with for people in town. It was like, oh, she met with no one, and she sees no one, and she speaks to people through walls. And once you hear someone speaks to people through walls, like, that's a very hard image to dismantle. It takes a lot to counter that, I think. So that...
Can I jump in with a question on that?
Yeah.
So but the whole film and all of your research shows that it's not that hard to access information that's a counterpoint, right? And it has been for a long time. So why has it stuck for so very long, that one image of her? Why has that narrative been the one that prevailed despite all the things you cite in your film and all the research that, again, I would assume Dickensian scholars have the same access that you have had.
Well, I would say two things. I would say if you can jump, I would say with several factors. If you could, Sasha, jump ahead to the yellow book cover. Go back. Okay, so this book is considered the definitive story of Emily Dickinson. Even in, it was published in 1974, even in 2008, the New Yorker called it that. It was, if you go to the next page, because it was 1974, you think, well, what does it have to do with what went on back then? Mabel's daughter, Millicent Mabel, who you see, who got the gingerbread, she wanted to protect her mother's legacy, even in the book itself, Richard Sewell, who wrote the book, said, it's in the preface, he wrote, her papers indispensable to the project came to Yale. She wanted, she said, the full story of her mother's involvement told, but told in the setting of a larger story of Emily Dickinson. So it was kind of a deal with the devil that he made, that he was going to write this story of Emily Dickinson. She was going to give him access to these papers that only she had. So after the double lawsuit, and I'm fine to leave some of this behind, but there's a scene in the movie where Lavinia talks about finding the trunk of papers. And this is really big. It's another one of the myths in terms of Emily Dickinson, which is she wrote all these poems, she hid them, she died, and then after she died, people found this trunk of poems, this trunk of papers with all these poems in them. Like, that's not true. That there was a trunk of poems, but Mabel's daughter had this trunk in her possession, and was able to, and Mabel and her daughter refused to give this trunk back to the Dickinsons after the lawsuit. They had the falling out, and actually at one point a hurricane came to Amherst, and there were a couple of hundred in that trunk that had never been published, that no one had copies of, and those could have been lost. But finally, when Mabel's daughter went to Richard Sewell at Yale and said, I'll give you access to these papers in exchange for you writing this book. So the book was commissioned purposefully he had access to these papers and he had to pay a very favorable position. And now Susan Dickinson had sued Mabel. The family had sued Mabel and won. So there was a lot of animosity between Mabel Todd and her descendants and Susan and Maddie being her descendant. So this book was treated like this scholarly tome, even though some of the jokes I mentioned last night that said things like, even though Mabel Todd never met Emily Dickinson face to face, she understood her better than anyone. Ridiculous statements. And one of the things that it did was it very strongly stated through the book that Emily and Susan were friends when they were girls, and that was it. And that they had a falling out, and it was an estranged relationship for their entire lives, the rest of it. So basically if you're asking,
what I'm trying to get at is, it seems as though when she was alive, people were invested in a narrative that kept her away from the public light because she wasn't conventional, because of the slant rhymes and everything else,
Right.
the weird punctuation and all that, all the things that we end up loving, right?
Yeah.
Weren't of the time. So at that time, she's shut out because of that. And various people have agendas in the family, and they keep her, whatever. And then after her death, one agenda moves forth, which is Mabel's, and it is convenient, again, because poetry is still emerging, and actually not still emerging, but it's convenient to look at her as a recluse. It's convenient to look at her as somebody who, couldn't get her work published, because that still supports the old narrative, right? But even, I guess what I'm asking is, as the time goes by, and people like Joyce Carol Oates get a hold of it and all that, and they're all writing. I mean, Joyce Carol Oates had a collection called Wild Nights, and people have acknowledged, and some of that's in your movie, how this narrative doesn't always hold up, and yet it's stuck. It's like, I would ask Jackie and Susan too, did you know any of this before you started this movie? And I have this picture of you guys going out after days of filming and like just sitting over drinks and rehashing every little bit of the history of Emily. I don't know if that happened or not, but it's so fascinating. I don't know how you can even let it go. So I'm just asking.
Right. Well, it's the same question that we ask ourselves, I think, in coming to this moment in the world that we are, where there is a reckoning, I think, where we just went through an election where, whatever you might think of Hillary Clinton's politics, we just saw a situation where the most qualified presidential candidate lost to the least qualified presidential candidate. And suddenly, we can no longer deny the fact that we live in a world where women are second-class citizens and women are unequal.
That's right. Yep.
The last to get the vote.
Yes,
Really?
last to get the
Always.
vote. But this is an endemic worldwide thing. Now, part of the way that the oppression of people happen is through systems of language. So the idea of having Emily Dickinson, who was a master really at her craft, that you take this woman, she's a genius, she's brilliant, she's visionary, she's subversive, she's living on her own terms, she writes these incredible poems, has satisfaction and love in her life, and you take that person and we're gonna turn her into the most miserable wretch. Just the thought, when anyone said Emily Dickinson when I was younger, I was, we're gonna take that person and that's who she's gonna be, and who wants to be that? So I think it's with what you're talking about, the tenacity of this, how is it held on? I mean, it started with different agendas. Mabel had an agenda where she felt that Susan was in the way, and she resented Susan, and she felt like she worked so hard. You saw the typewriter twisting that thing and typing the letters, and she got Higginson on board, and she got the reviewer, and she did all these things. So the idea of acknowledging what Susan did in Emily's life was enraged her. I think, just make it stop. So she had her agenda against Susan. Then as time went on and other stuff came out, going back to the Green Book here, this book here, go ahead a couple slides. No, go back. So the riddle of Emily Dickinson, when this stuff started to come out, really first started to come out was 1951, where the scholars thought, oh, I'm gonna write about Emily Dickinson. She knew she was friends with Kate Scott Anthony. She went to the relatives for letters. They're like, oh, great, Emily Dickinson, she's famous. Are you going to write it? Oh, they didn't even know. She got the letters. She started going through the letters, and then she started to find, oh my God, they had this affair, and she was excited by the information, went back to the family, like, you won't believe what I found out. Family was totally horrified, took the letters back, took the permission back, and then after that, Mabel's daughter went back to Richard Sewell, who she'd only discussed the possibility with, and was like, went and got that book in motion. Because this threatened to define Emily Dickinson. And also what was called the master letters came out. All these people were nervous. It was an unfortunate collusion of forces where there was the people who knew Emily, who during the McCarthy era, being a homosexual was the equivalent of being a communist. Like it was really like a horrible thing, as opposed to now when it's just lovely and flowers and everything is great. But when this came out, there were people who were horrified by it and just were homophobes who wanted to suppress it. Then there were other people who loved Emily Dickinson's work, who felt like if this was known about her, they wouldn't read her poems, and she wanted her poems read so badly.
Yeah.
So there was that, I would say, just through these opposite sides that, and then there was the idea that there was the problem of people even being able to identify these relationships.
Right. I have someone who's dying to ask a question right here.
So I have a question. I want to thank you for the film. I have a question which, is just intriguing. You are so completely serious about this material in the way you describe it and express it. Why is it that you made the movie a comedy as opposed to a serious drama, like a narrative drama without a comedy?
Right. I have found that people don't like being lectured about feminism. It's something I've come across. Aside from the fact that I work in comedy, I make comic stories, and this is definitely the most serious film I've ever made. I think that I initially, when I made this movie and started to screen it, one of the things I did become aware of is that young people are able to relate to comedy better, and part of the idea of the new feminist movement is that we're including everyone, and comedy is a populist form. I also personally found it funny, just in terms of what you're saying. The level of denial was hilarious to me. It was just all over the place, and those letters, sure, there's Emily's letters to Austin that Mabel handled that she erased. Then there's all these other letters and all these other poems that have just been sitting out there for years. The book of Emily and Susan's letters that Martha Nell Smith, Open Me Carefully, put together, that came out in 1998 or 99. That's been there. And when you're talking about, well, why, there's just a major movie that is always brought up to me, A Quiet Passion. And that was just made. That was very much the traditional image of Emily Dickinson as a miserable wretch who, Terrence Davies in this article said, she died in the prison of her, And it was interesting because Harvard had called, because Harvard holds the rights to Emily Dickinson's work, and Harvard had called Martha Nell Smith up to come up and watch the film and comment on the veracity of it. And they... Your film or? No.
Quiet Passion.
Quiet Passion. And they put her in the same B&B as Terrence Davies. So after the screening that night, they were both coming in at the same time. And he was drunk. And he said to her, "You didn't like my movie, did you?" And she said, "I didn't say that, but I just have one question. Did you read the letters. And he said, I didn't have the time to read the letters. So that says a lot. There was always the feeling, and this I'm talking about Emily Dickinson overall as a poet. The way that she wasn't taken seriously as a poet is one reason. The way that women aren't taken seriously is one reason for the tenacity of this myth. Because to this director, getting however many millions of dollars production to make his movie, it wasn't worth his time. I think that part of what by claiming that Emily Dickinson wasn't a poet sending her work out which she was. This is all documented. This isn't my agenda or my, these are things that she did. When I realized, oh my God, Emily Dickinson copied 800 poems into booklets and sent them out to people. I was like, that's someone who wants their work read. When I found out that Emily Dickinson had 3 pictures of women writers on the wall, I was like, that's someone who is a writer. That's someone who sees themselves in the lineage of women writers. But the way that it's made into almost like it's like she had some kind of a love disaster, and these were just journal scribblings, and she didn't want anyone to read them. So it's a very collusion, and then there are people.
It's a big word right now, collusion.
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question of Jackie and Susan, just because so with all of this, first of all, you've got the poet who is legendary at this point, right? It's the Beyonce of poetry. And you've got some responsibility to play her, but you've got responsibility to play the people in her circle, her inner circle. And this delicate balance of comedy and drama. And I'm just wondering how you feel as an actress about the responsibility of portraying people who are real people, and now it's a counter narrative to the one that most people know. And first of all, is it enjoyable? And is it a burden? Are you constantly looking into the material to try to, different line readings and stuff, to try to figure out how that plays the best? And
it's the same thing with comedy. It's like you can't play funny. That's like the death of comedy, actually. You have to play the truth of the situation. I mean, in terms of her physically or how Susan behaved, you don't know. I have no film. There's like a couple of really attractive photos. Photos back then. I mean, they used to post dead people in photos, and they all could have been. Anyway, no, really, the dead people look just as good as the
Well,
alive.
they put this clamp on the back of your neck to hold your head still.
Oh,
That's why everyone always looks so uncomfortable in those old photos.
Yeah. So basically, you just have to play the truth of the moment, and if it's funny, it's going to be funny, right? And as Madeleine was saying, I was not a big scholar of Emily Dickinson. It wasn't really hard for me to believe that, she and Susan were involved, because I hadn't been indoctrinated. But just looking at this situation from the outside, you're just like, it is totally hilarious. Hilarious. I mean, as all of us who are in a group of people who you don't have like your basic civil rights, it's just like, are you kidding? What? How does this not make sense to you?
And the character of Lavinia is, or the person, that's a really complicated, how did you go at that? Is she simple? Is she not?
I think she was pretty clever, but her life was kind of ripped from her because she thought she was marrying the love of her life, and he felt that he was that wasn't possible. You weren't able to marry somebody that you were gonna have so much fun with. So he had to marry a stick in the mud. So he married somebody else instead of Lavinia. So I think that she was, kind of gave up a little bit. And, kind of felt the same way. But I feel like truth is always funnier than fiction. My ex-wife is a writer, and she wrote a story that I did in one of her classes, and the teacher was like, "That could never happen. That's not, that's not believable." And she's like, "It did happen." Never did that. But yeah, I feel like truth is always funnier than something that you can make up. And yeah, with Emily Dickinson, I growing up, you just heard her name and thought of a recluse spinster woman who was miserable, that you didn't want to be like. Like, that is all you heard.
Yeah,
And
the
just
Belle of Amherst.
To add to that, Sasha, if you could just go forward through these things. It's keep going. Keep going. Up, go backwards. Here. Whoop, yeah. So Lavinia played a very important part. That was when Lavinia went and found that chunk of poems, it was a discovery for Lavinia. And somehow that got twisted into, so Mabel was telling that story and Lavinia goes in and so it's very dramatic. It goes along with this idea of a woman not wanting anything for herself. We can love and celebrate her poetry. Because she didn't want us to read it, because she never imagined, or she only wanted us to read it after her death. All of those things made it possible. The idea that Emily Dickinson was a real writer with ambition who wanted to be published. I always go back to thinking of how, because women's history is erased, each woman has to invent their own path for themselves. When Hillary Clinton ran for president, at one point there was a rumor that gained traction that Hillary Clinton was running a pederasty pizza parlor because she was kind of a witch. You know what I mean? Because people hadn't seen, look at her, she's ambitious, she wants things, she's a shrew, she's this, she's that. So this idea that Emily just hid her poems away in a trunk and, didn't want people to read them, that was really important in terms of selling her. It was socially acceptable to celebrate her when she was dead, as opposed to the real story, which is Emily tried to get published, tried, sent her poems out, was rejected. Finally, her sister, knowing how much it meant to her after her death, paid for the book. And that's just so important.
Do all three of you should Mabel be viewed as a villain? Is she an opportunist? Is she, how would you view her?
Discussing this last night, and Mabel's a victim of the time as well. And it's kind of interesting, like, would these have been published without Mabel? She had to do what she had to do, in a sense where, we were part of the system, and she worked the system to get Emily published.
Well, I think, just remember.
She was and wasn't.
No, but Lavinia paid for Emily. The only reason Emily was published was Lavinia paid for it. That was the only reason the book was published, was because it was paid for. Now, in terms of selling it and putting it together, all those things, because she was driven, because she was Austin's mistress, she wasn't going to get this acknowledgement. She wanted to publish her love letters with Austin, and he was like, no, you can't do that. So she had already been censored and edited herself. And she was savvy and found her way around. I think she was a survivor.
Yeah. It's hard to blame. She comes across, obviously, as a person with a lot of problems and craftiness and whatever, and an agenda, but it's hard to blame her more than the men in the film who are...
I think that she was complicated, and but she was driven. And I think that quote at the beginning really summarizes her, that says, There are those who are shallow intentionally and only profound by accident. I mean, it was profound what she did. But now, and then just the last, very last slide, or whatever it's called. So a note that Emily wrote in the weeks before her death to Susan. You remember which whispered to Horatio. So this was the quote: "Oh, good Horatio, what a damaged reputation I'm leaving behind me, as no one knows the truth. If you ever love me, then please postpone the sweet relief of death a while and stay in this harsh world long enough to tell my story." So in telling the story of Emily Dickinson, one of the things that happened after the first two books was women started to show up at the Dickinson homestead, saying, "Is this where the lady poet lived?" Because she was brilliant and people were so moved by her poetry, and she was a woman, they wanted to know how she did it. And by this misrepresentation of her life that has gone on for so long for reasons of misogyny, we haven't been able to have her example of how she lived and the choices she made in trying to get her work out there that led to them ultimately getting out there. I don't think Lavinia would have paid for that book unless she had known, because that how badly Emily wanted to be published. And it's very important that her story is told, of her true self, because we're seeing the results right now with Donald Trump as our president. There is a cost to erasing women's stories and us remaining the second-class citizens.
Here, here. Well said, well said. And you all have told that story. Thank you. Okay, so I think we need to, because a lot of people need to get to a movie. Probably, if you want to ask a question, there's probably more time in the lobby, but I'm being given the cue. I just want to say thank you for this movie. I wonder whether you could go after a forensic history of other women that may have also been subject to all of this, and maybe make it a series. Thank you all for coming. And